This is the Crime Cafe, where you get to hear from some of the best crime, suspense, and thriller authors in publishing today. I'm your host, Debbi Mack, and before I introduce my guest, I would like to remind you that you can buy the Crime Cafe story package from my website, crimecafe.net. All you have to do is go there and click on the words Crime Cafe, the link, and it'll lead you to the PayPal buy button. It's only 99 cents, and it includes stories from all the authors who are interviewed here at Crime Cafe. So, having said that, there's also an online store. You might want to check that out as well, where you can get cool t-shirts like the one I'm wearing. And having said that, let me introduce my guest, a very talented horror crime fiction author, W.D. Gagliani, or Bill Gagliani, as I like to call him. So welcome to the show, Bill. It's wonderful to have you on.
Well, thank you, Debbie. It's great to be a guest on your show.
I'm so glad you're here, and I've enjoyed your work so much. Tell us about the Nick Lupo series. What kind of a person is Nick Lupo? And give us a little background about the series itself and how you came up with it.
Sure. Well, great. Thank you. And thanks for the compliment. I appreciate that. Well, Nick Lupo is really sort of a version of me in a way. He's a cop. I'm not a cop, but I mean, I always watched cop shows, so I was always interested in that sort of crime fighting career. And he's from an Italian American household. He's an only child. I'm an only child, and we had similar backgrounds in some ways. He has very similar tastes in music to mine, and he sort of grew out of an interest that I had in writing something different than a PI novel, even though I loved those. And but even though I read a lot of mystery and thrillers when I was a kid, I also eventually met Stephen King through the book Salem's Lot. And, I was sort of lost to horror then. And so even though I was working in horror, I still wanted to bring in thriller elements. And he grew out of my need to bring those two together. And so even though he's a version of me, I made him a werewolf, which would be a little different. And I wanted to play with the idea of the hero as monster and vice versa, so to speak, to go back and forth and have him doubt himself and be really negative about his condition and sort of face things as they came up.
That's really a unique obstacle for the protagonist.
I guess, yeah, in a way. I mean, I'd seen this had been done with vampires. And in literature in the 80s and 90s. And I just, I always found that werewolves were always presented as the antagonist. And even though vampires had started to become more heroic, or at least becoming the protagonist that you root for, I felt that the werewolf was, underappreciated. And I thought, and it was interesting to me to think, what would be the obstacles that a homicide detective would have if he happened to be a werewolf, and how would he get through the day and so forth. And I tried to bring in what I thought was at least logical, sort of a logical approach to his everyday life.
I think that's pretty cool. I mean, it's like an underserved paranormal there,
Right.
werewolf.
Well, I thought so at the time, and I started the first book, Wolf's Trap, in the early '90s, and it took me a long time to finish because I wasn't working on it consistently. And I think I was really one of the first, authors to try and look at it that way. I'm not saying I started any wave or anything, but my publisher at the time that eventually picked up Wolf's Trap did eventually start featuring more werewolf novels. So I think I was at least kind of riding the crest of a wave in that sense at that publisher. But in the meantime, I think paranormal and urban fantasy really came a long way, and we started to see in those genres a lot of werewolf protagonists. But I started my book in, I think, maybe late '93, and so I might have been kind of ahead of the curve a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't maybe the first to print, but I was certainly the first looking at it, I think.
Well, I think he's a very, very interesting protagonist, and good for you for standing up for the werewolf in that way. I would think it also gives him a certain amount of advantage when he has to deal with adversaries who are similarly afflicted, shall we
Right.
say?
Right. Well, in the first book, he doesn't meet any other werewolves, and so he sort of thinks he's the only one,
Mm-hmm.
only dealing with flesh and blood enemies, even though his the major protagonist in that book is a serial killer who does know his secret, even though he's not quite sure that it's true. But he's working off of his sister's journal, so he knows that there's something going on there, and whether he believes it or not, he treats it as real. Lupo doesn't actually meet any other werewolves until the second novel in that series, and then that was because I needed to write a sequel because the sales had been pretty good, and so my publisher said, "Please write a sequel." And then I thought, well, I have to bring in other werewolves, or else what am I going to do? And sort of during that time period, I decided he would never meet any other monsters. I wouldn't bring in, I wouldn't do the Laurel K. Hamilton and bring in all the different monster types and so forth. I just wanted to keep it very unique and
Mm-hmm.
to give it only the one conceit, which is that werewolves do exist. But other than that, everything is normal and straightforward.
Interesting. So this is kind of a cross between paranormal and crime fiction then, which is cool. Tell us about your latest book? Where does it take Nick Lupo?
Right. Wolf's Blind was just published at the beginning of December, and it's the sixth novel in the series. And there's been a long thread. This is a really complicated story. Has become a complicated storyline to describe, but he has sort of come to be an obstacle in the way of this very large conspiracy of werewolves, I guess you could say. There is there was a security agency very much like one called Blackwater. That's a real one, except in my books they were mostly werewolves, and they were involved in trying to take over the Pentagon, and so there's a whole conspiracy theory that runs through the whole thing, and
Wow.
they're very evil, and they have their roots in the Nazis, of course, in World War II. And well, I brought in some family history because my parents were are Italian, and they grew up during World War II in Italy, and
Wow.
so they lived in Italy right when the Germans were actually allies with Italy, and were in Italy. They were, an ally force that was in Italy. And when Italy surrendered in 1943, the Germans that were there became an occupying force. And the Allies, of course, were bombing the Germans. And so my parents lived through Allied bombings and German occupation, and then the entire liberation of the country and so forth. So I got a lot of stories from my parents that
Wow. I'll just bet.
yeah, it was, I got a lot of stories from them about what life was like in that time period. And when I was looking for a background for Lupo, I'd given him a kind of a stern father. And, my father was a relatively stern man, not in any really bad way, but he was kind of a very serious man. And when I was looking for a background for Lupo, and then I immediately went back and thought of his father, my father, and their youth, and I basically put my father's character into his father's character, except I gave him a whole encounter with werewolves because the Nazis had werewolves at the end of the war. And so there's a whole thread, there's a parallel story that Lupo's in the present fighting with this particular secret group of werewolf mercenaries, basically. But it turns out that his father and his grandfather had also run into them right during the war. And so there's a parallel story. So and just to go back to your question, in Wolf's Blind, now Lupo is still dealing with this secret enemy. But in the meantime, there's a parallel story that shows his father as a young man following werewolves across the sea from Italy to Argentina because the Nazis were escaping from, obviously from Europe to South America. And my father actually made that journey. So I kind of plugged in some of the things that I knew from his background and made it all happen to Lupo's father. And in the meantime, he's also run afoul of the local mafia. So I think I really put a lot of plot into that book.
Wow.
More plot than there are pages.
My goodness, that sounds really intriguing. Putting that historical angle in there is really cool.
Yeah.
Let's see, you also wrote some straight crime thrillers, at least one that I know of, Savage Nights.
Yes.
What prompted you to write that story?
That was the second book that I wrote actually right after Wolf's Trap, and I was simply writing. My publisher at the time was Leisure Books, and they had a thriller line. And even though they had published Wolf's Trap as horror, I've always been I grew up reading British thrillers mostly, and I always wanted to write a thriller. And so I wanted to write something for their line, which they eventually did not accept. However, I got some good responses from that book. It was a book that I wanted to sort of marry my love of thrillers with sort of that whole human trafficking kind of plot line that actually the movie Taken is very similar to my novel, and I'm very proud to say that I was finished with my novel before that movie opened.
My goodness.
And of course, they've written like 2 sequels to Taken, the Liam Neeson franchise, which, it's reasonably, it's very exciting. It's not, it's not bad at all, but there are actually several plot devices that are very similar in Savage Nights and Taken. But I actually have a disclaimer in there that I finished it before that movie came out. Not that
my goodness.
Believe me, but
I believe you.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was fun to write, and I wrote. I like writing in different points of view. So I had I had a cop, a woman cop who was involved through an ex-Vietnam vet who was a tunnel rat and whose niece has been kidnapped and has disappeared, obviously. And he comes to learn fairly quickly that she may have been kidnapped for purposes of sex trafficking. And so it turns into a race against time for him to figure out how to get her out of the clutches of some really, really bad guys. And he enlists a couple of old Vietnam buddies. And of course, I love flashbacks. So even though I've been warned that too many flashbacks are a distraction, I can't get away from doing it. And so I put in a lot of research that I had on tunnel rats and how their lives were. And I put in a very slight paranormal element because Brant, the protagonist, is a little bit inconsistently psychic. He has kind of a psychic bond with his niece, which comes and goes. Right. And I sort of wanted that mysterious element in there. And it's sort of, the book sort of implies that it kind of happened when he was in Vietnam in one of the tunnels.
Yeah. I remember that now. And sounds like that book has cinematic potential.
I thought it had, but as it turns out, several houses passed on it. I think my agent at the time said it was probably just a little too violent and a little too graphic in general. And so both, with sex and violence. And I think it probably did the book a disservice in a way. But I've had some really good reviews on it. My Amazon product page has a lot of 5-star reviews because people that have read it generally enjoy it. So,
well, that's fantastic. I'll have to keep that in mind if I want to option a book or find a producer who wants to option a book, and I'll do the screenplay.
Well, that is great. In fact, I know you've done some screenplay work. So
yes, that's right. Now tell me about your young adult novel, the one you collaborated on.
Yes.
I was really intrigued by all the issues you brought up in that one.
Yeah.
Environmental issues, coming of age issues. It was really something.
Yeah, it was called I Was the Seventh Grade Monster Hunter.
Yes.
Yes, it was a collaboration between Dave Benton and I. Dave is a friend of mine and a musician, and we've collaborated on numerous short stories. And we both had a real urge to write something for middle grade or young adult. We settled on middle grade, but we really wanted to hit one or the other. I've always been, I mean, I started out reading things like uh, uh, the Hardy Boys is one that I actually have helped me learn English, believe it or not, because English was a second language for me.
I
Even
was going to say, you're from Italy, aren't you?
well, I was actually born here, but there's a long, complicated story. But born here, went back there, and grew up there, and
Ah,
then came back here in 1967. And so I did have to learn English almost from scratch. And the Hardy Boys books may not be great literature, but they were a good way for me to really learn the language. And obviously, I was already a reader, and so obviously, I knew that I wanted to write that kind of book. And so I read other series like The Three Investigators was one that I loved, and there was one that was kind of a Midwestern series that only went to 6 books, but I loved it. It was called the Brains Benton books. Um, and my friend Dave's last name is Benton, which is interesting. That character's name is Benton, and so we had kind of a laugh about it, and we talked about writing something like that, and we wanted to bring in some our love of universal monsters, even though that's not what's in the book. They are sort of representative of those monsters, and we have a strong female protagonist who has powers she's not quite aware of, and kind of a long family legacy that we played around with the Stoker name. And then we, as you mentioned, we brought a few environmental issues in there, and kind of had really a really fun time writing this story for middle grade.
I think it's a fantastic book, and more people should know about it.
Oh, thank you.
Um, can you picture any of your books as a movie or a TV show? And if so, who would you imagine playing the lead role?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I can certainly imagine it. Uh, Strangely enough, if you take the show Grimm and
Mm-hmm.
show Teen Wolf and kind of squash them together, you have kind of a sense of what a series of Lupo stories would look like, I think. Um, David Giuntoli, who actually plays another Nick in Grimm, he plays Nick Burkhardt, who's a cop, and he's the Grimm. Um, he actually would probably look just fine playing Nick Lupo right now because he has that sort of vaguely Italian look, but not too much. He's not, he's not like stereotypically Italian, but I think he kind of fits the physical type. When I was writing Wolf's Trap in the '90s and then later on the sequels, I always thought that. Kind of a combination of Joe Mantegna and Andy Garcia. I kind of pictured that as Nick Lupo.
Those are great choices. I love those actors.
I know, I love them too. Unfortunately, of course, they've gotten older, so now maybe less so. But I mean, in terms of their look, but when they were, still young and like in The Godfather, you've got Andy Garcia was in Godfather 2, if I remember correctly. Um, anyway, when that look really, struck me that Lupo would probably look just like that.
Kind
Um,
of dark and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, kind of a tall, broad-shouldered guy, but not overly muscled or anything like that. And of course, he doesn't need to be because he's a werewolf. So
Uh-huh.
I always describe him as being kind of an oversized werewolf, and I don't know where that came from because he's not an oversized human male or anything like that. But I always wanted him to be to seem more menacing as a werewolf, and of course he hates. And certainly at the beginning of the series, he hates being a werewolf because he has no control over it, or he thinks he doesn't. But he learns a lot through the 6 books, and so by the 6th book, he's pretty handy at changing and so forth. He doesn't need the full moon to change, but he didn't know that at first because no one
Hmm.
told.
Interesting. Okay, well, before we wrap up, I just want to ask you one other thing. What authors or TV shows or movies have most influenced your writing? And is there anything else you'd like to add before we end?
Sure. Boy, that's a long list of people. Uh, yeah,
Most influential.
I know. Um, well, I think I've always been a fan of Harlan Ellison and Philip K. Dick, which have not influenced my style so much, but I think certainly my worldview. And then in the '70s, Stephen King, James Herbert, and Peter Straub also. And then in the '80s, I met the Splatterpunks, and I really enjoyed, Richard Lehman, uh, Ray Garton. I'm trying to think, Skip Inspector, uh, and of course Robert McCammon, who wrote The Wolf's Hour, which is probably one of the best werewolf novels anyone will ever write, and also has a World War II. It's set in World War II, so obviously that also was in my head when I started developing that background for Lupo. It made me understand that I could do that. In thrillers, Alistair MacLean, Desmond Bagley, Duncan Kyle. Those are like the basics. I'm also a huge fan of Tim Powers and James Blaylock, the original steampunks. And even though I haven't written a lot of steampunk, I have some stuff in the back on the back burner that is in that area.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
And
you for having me.
oh, it was my pleasure, believe me. And it was wonderful to talk to you today. And I hope everybody enjoyed it as well.
Should I mention?
Please, yes, please do.
My website, wdgagliani.com, and on Facebook, WD Gagliani. So feel free to look me up.
Cool. Okay, then. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you.
And just one more reminder that if you would like to get a copy of the Crime Cafe story package, all you have to do is go to crimecafe.net and click on the words Crime Cafe. You'll find a PayPal button where you can purchase all of the stories that have been contributed by the authors interviewed here, in addition to the Crime Cafe merchandise, which is in my store. So with that said, thanks again, Bill, and I'll see everybody else in 2 weeks.